Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to my presentation today. I'm Saran Shiroza from Sophia University in Japan. Today, I am reporting on an action research study using the extensive listening project that was intended to raise student awareness about the diversity in English through increasing exposure to authentic materials in different varieties of English. As a background to the study, I'd like to introduce the concept of TEIL, T-E-I-L, or Teaching English as an International Language. As a global language, English is now used by more non-native speakers than by native speakers in many parts of the world, and learned by an even greater number of people across the globe. The increasing population of multilingual English users are developing new norms of English usage. This social-linguistic reality of English has significant implications for the teaching and learning of English, and many researchers have called for a major paradigm shift from the teaching of English as a second or a foreign language to teaching English as an international language. As a central tenet, TEIL strongly questions the relevance of native speaker norms and emphasizes the need to acknowledge the linguistic, cultural, and functional diversity in English in language teaching contexts. The major components of TEIL include, among other things, exposure to different varieties of English, as well as different types of English users. This is in order to raise student awareness of the pluralistic nature of English and to better prepare them for communication with English users from diverse backgrounds. However, the classroom reality is slow to adapt to the shift in the conceptualization of English. Teaching materials, especially the standard textbooks, are heavily focused on native speaker English. While many textbooks now feature illustrations and photographs of people from various racial and ethnic backgrounds, this does not necessarily mean that they reflect the linguistic diversity of English. The audio materials that accompany these textbooks are predominantly native speaker English, and in the case of Japan, almost always American English. Therefore, the need arises to compensate the lack of exposure for students to diverse Englishes with outside classroom activities, in order to equip them with knowledge and awareness about the changing reality of English. To address this gap, I have employed extensive listening activity using online listening journals. Extensive listening is a language learning technique where learners listen to a large amount of audio input that is comprehensible and enjoyable for them, without necessarily focusing on understanding the detail, but rather aiming to develop familiarity with the target language and improving overall comprehension skills. To provide guidance and prompts for extensive listening outside classrooms, listening journals become useful. Listening journals are defined as books or other forms of logs in which students record their extensive and intensive listening practices, as well as reflections on their listening experiences. Here are some previous studies that support the effectiveness of listening journals as pedagogical tools in language learning contexts. I do not have the time to go over in detail, but in summary, listening journal activities can motivate students for further learning because they provide a highly autonomous learning experience, meaningful and comprehensible listening of authentic English, and the opportunity to reflect on their own learning. And in particular, Galloway and Rose 2014 used listening journals to encourage students to listen to a diversity of English spoken by native and non-native users. The present study, then, aims to explore how the extensive listening activity using listening journals can contribute to increasing student exposure to the diversity in English and raising their awareness about the pluralistic nature of English. So I set out to explore the following research questions. Number 1, does extensive listening using listening journals contribute to increasing exposure to varieties of English? Number 2, does the activity contribute to improving student understanding of different English accents? And number 3, what types of Englishes do students listen to, and what are their responses to them? The research site is an English skills course for first-year students at a private university in Japan. The course had a dual objective of expanding academic vocabulary and improving listening skills. It is taught twice a week for 14 weeks over 2 consecutive semesters, and in every class, a vocabulary and listening quiz was given at the beginning. The quiz was based on the main textbook, English Vocabulary in Use for the Upper Intermediate level, a fairly standard textbook on the standard English. In all, the study involved 104 freshman students who major in English studies. The students had various levels of English proficiency, ranging from lower intermediate to advanced. Half of the students had overseas experience, but mostly limited to short stays for a few weeks. 18 students had experience living in English-speaking countries for longer than 1 year. Over the 2 semesters, students were asked to do a weekly listening activity outside classroom using any resources they had available. Throughout the course, they were encouraged to explore materials in which they can listen to unfamiliar varieties of English. The data for this study is the results of the year initial and year-end surveys and the listening journal entries. 101 students responded to the pre-course survey and 54 to the post-course survey that asked about their listening practices, confidence in English skills, and evaluation of the activity using the 5-point Likert scale. At the end of the academic year, there were over 2,400 journal entries from 104 registered students. The listening journals were collected through a Google form. You can take a look at the sample form by scanning the QR code on the screen. The form asked students to write a summary of what they listened to and any reflections on the content or the listening activity itself. They also rated the difficulty of the materials using the 5-point scale in terms of speed, vocabulary, topic, and accent, and how much they want to recommend the material to other students. The survey results were tabulated and the journal entries were thematically analyzed. Here, I introduced the survey results and some student comments according to the 3 research questions. Research question 1 is about whether the extensive listening activity using listening journals contributed to increasing student exposure to varieties of English. As the figure shows, the overwhelming majority of students felt that they had more opportunities to listen to different English accents through the extensive listening activity, with 41% strongly agreeing and 37% agreeing. The second research question was about student confidence in understanding different English accents. Although statistical significance is not established, more students felt confident in understanding different accents in English after they'd engaged in this activity for 2 semesters. So then, what types of English did the students listen to for this activity? That was my research question 3. In fact, when asked about how they picked materials, they revealed a clear preference for native speaker English to non-native speaker English. While about a third of the students constantly tried to listen to non-native varieties of English, more than half said they usually sought native speaker English materials. What this suggests is that students had more opportunities to listen to varieties of English but the variation is mostly limited to native speaker Englishes. But a closer look at student responses tells us that listening to native varieties of English was still helpful in raising their variety awareness. One student wrote in the journal that she had been biased toward American English until she started this listening activity. Another student found Scottish English very difficult to understand and thought that the goal of learning English is to become able to understand non-native Englishes without difficulty. Yet another student, who listened to an interview in Australian English, realized that there are different accents even in the same country. So there's not a single Australian English, but different varieties of Australian Englishes. In addition, those who listened to non-native Englishes mostly responded very favorably, pointing out that non-native varieties are highly intelligible. One student listened to an interview with Dalai Lama and found that although his pronunciation is somewhat different from the standard, what matters is the content and the desire to communicate, and it is important to try to use English without fearing mistakes. Another student watched an interview with a Japanese pianist who won second prize in an international Chopin piano competition in 2021. The student wrote that the interviewee's English sounds very Japanese, but was still very easy to understand. And the student found it instructive in terms of both listening and speaking in English. These student comments suggest that recognizing the diversity in English can encourage students to take pride in their own English pronunciation and use the language as part of their linguistic repertoire. To summarize, I'd conclude that the extensive listening activity using listening journals contributed to increasing exposure to varieties of English, and students felt more confident in understanding different English accents. Although many students preferred listening to native speaker English, exposure to the variation within native Englishes still helped the students realize the pluralistic nature of English. And listening to non-native Englishes, including the students' own variety, provided them with good role models of proficient users of English as a lingua franca. For future studies and practices, more in-depth analysis and follow-up interviews would be desired to gain a deeper understanding of the impact of extensive listening activities on language learners. And to make the most of such activities, some guidelines would be useful. It is important to clarify the objectives of the activity, whether it is to provide autonomous learning opportunity, to develop overall familiarity with the target language, or to increase exposure to varieties of input. Clear instructions about what to write in the journals are also necessary to give students a better idea about assignment requirements. Additionally, providing feedback on journal entries will help students reflect on their awareness about the linguistic and cultural diversity of English speakers. I hope this study provided some insights for implementing the principles of TEAL and creating more diversity-sensitive language classrooms. Here's a list of references. Thank you for watching my presentation. Now I'd like to invite you to ask any questions you may have.